The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home.
We want this country for ourselves.
This is Harry Rosen, the embassy's press attaché.
On November 4th, 1979, a mob of Iranian protesters seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 63 people prisoner. They later took 3 more. The Iranian rebels were angry with the U.S. for allowing Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the oppressive royal who gained control in Iran with American help, to reside in the U.S. for cancer treatment. The hostages were not killed. Rather, they were touted in front of TV cameras and used to represent Iranian resistance to Western influence. The American people were furious, viewing the hostage-taking as a baseless attack on the United States. What the American people didn't realize at the time was that the hostage crisis was not baseless. It is the story of an alliance shaken to the core by the events of 1979 and 1980, and a camaraderie which deteriorated into enmity as the result of the growth of anti-Western sentiments in Iran, American new sensationalism, and the embargoes placed on Iran by the U.S. The relationship between America and Iran first developed in the late 1940s, but America didn't become fully involved until 1953, when Mohammad Mossadegh, an extreme nationalist, rose to power in Iran, and the U.S. worried that his policies could lead to the subversion of Iran by the Soviet Union. Afraid that their ally would become communist, the U.S. government, under President Eisenhower, arranged for a coup to give Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the U.S.-backed contender for power in Iran, absolute control over the country. Many in Iran were angered that the U.S. wasn't respecting their autonomy. Over the next 2.5 decades, this anger would grow as Iran became increasingly more unstable under the Shah's rule. The Shah had initially been favored by the U.S. for the support of Western ideals such as secularism and capitalism. The traditional Islamic clergy feared losing their power. The Shah turned a blind eye to the floundering economy and skyrocketing inflation, and his policies began to upset many others as well. The Islamic clergy that had opposed the Shah from the beginning unified with other groups to lead the movement to topple him, promoting traditional Islamic values along the way. Speaking as a private citizen, Mark Torak offered insight on the situation.
In that it was a religiously motivated revolution. It eventually became a Shiite Islamic revolution, as you know. There were communists running around Iran. What do you believe? They had their own political party that the Soviet Union would support. And eventually they got eliminated, became a purely Shiite revolution.
Meanwhile, America was almost entirely ignorant of how severe the situation in Iran was. They were receiving their intelligence about the state of Iran from Savak, who insisted that the revolts were being perpetuated by communist minority groups who posed no threat to the Shah's regime. And when Jimmy Carter stepped into office in 1977, he assumed that Iran would be a stable ally. But by 1978, it became clear to him that there was trouble as the rebellions had filled every major city. Savak responded brutally but indecisively, and they began to lose control over the country. The Shah's physical condition was also declining, as he was fighting lymphoma. Finally, on January 16, 1979, the Shah was forced to leave Iran. The Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and opposition leaders and Islamic clergymen took charge of the country. However, when the Shah requested admission to the U.S. for cancer treatment, and Carter agreed, the Iranian rebels became enraged once more. On November 4th, the embassy was seized and the Iranian hostage crisis began. As Iran's discontent with Western culture grew, so did the American people's dislike for Iran. America in the 1970s was, to some extent, still high on the victory culture of World War II. The American people were used to believing that their country was one of the greatest in the world. As the 1970s began, this idea started to unravel. An oil panic, combined with an economic recession, brought the country to its knees. Many Americans were hungry for someone to blame. Then, the hostage crisis came along and shook the U.S. to its core. Most Americans knew nothing of Operation Ajax, or Iranian politics. They only knew that some 60-odd Americans were being held captive by a now hostile foreign country. At the time, TV news was just becoming popular. Each network portrayed the crisis in a similar way, as a direct attack on the US, giving little to no historical context for the event. America grew increasingly more frightened and enraged as Walter Cronkite's voice echoed throughout their houses.
Thursday, April 24th, 1980, the 173rd day of captivity for the American hostages in Iran.
And you know, this really in many ways was a media confrontation. The Iranians, you know, I don't think they killed anyone, you know, but their goal was to show that, hey, we're in control here. You know, a country that has a real chip on its shoulder about foreign intervention and domination wanted to use that.
Negotiations officially began on November 7th of 1979 when Jimmy Carter sent former Attorney General Ramsey Clark and Senate Intelligence Committee staff member William Miller to Iran to negotiate the release of the hostages. But Ayatollah Khomeini refused to meet with them. Within the US government, there was a lack of understanding of the nature of the captors' motives during the Iranian hostage crisis. Carter's traditional negotiation methods did little to move Iranian revolutionaries. By April of 1980, the American government began to seek a military resolution to the conflict.
You can always, if the situation goes south, you can always get out of it or use military power. So you have these things. I think most diplomats and most national security people would endorse the idea that it's the best you can get. You don't always get a whole loaf of bread when you're doing foreign relations. The world is a dangerous, tricky, complicated place.
This led to one of the most notorious failures of Carter's administration, a rescue mission called Operation Eagle Claw. This mission, launched on April 24th, was an absolute catastrophe as 2 of the 8 helicopters deployed for the mission malfunctioned before arrival at the first checkpoint, and the 3rd helicopter collided with a support aircraft. 8 US soldiers were killed, and their bodies were paraded in front of Iranian TV cameras before the Carter administration could even have them returned to the US. This event was a severe blow to US morale, but more specifically, it was an unbelievable blow to Carter's campaign.
Carter appeared weak, vacillating, incapable.
Despite these difficulties, Carter eventually began to resolve the tumultuous situation. By May of 1980, the United States had convinced its closest allies to institute an economic embargo against Iran. Unfortunately, the embargo alone was not enough to weaken the country. However, it did increase animosity between America and Iran even further. What really forced Iran to back down was the subsequent Iran-Iraq War. The embargoes instituted on Iran, combined with war expenses, devastated its economy. Iranian Prime Minister at the time, Mohammad Ali Reza, visited the UN to request assistance, but UN officials informed that they would not receive any support until the release of the US hostages. Backed into a corner, Iranian officials engaged in negotiations with renewed vigor, and negotiations continued throughout late 1980 and early 1981.
They eventually needed that money badly enough, and there was some quid pro quo, I suppose, that yeah, you can free the hostages and then you can get this. In fact, the money was transferred and then the hostages were freed. So that's really what broke it. This being foreign policy, you have to jump on any train of opportunity that presents itself. So in that sense, I suppose the Iraq War was used to gain leverage over Iran.
For the most part, Iranian demands centered largely on releasing frozen Iranian assets and lifting the trade embargo. Once an agreement was made, the hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, minutes after the inauguration of the new US President Ronald Reagan, and all that was left were 2 former allies with a deep distrust for each other.
That began imagine a sweater string coming out and it being unraveled. That's exactly what happened.
The United States and Iran share an incredibly complex and fascinating history, one filled with plights, scandal, and diplomacy. The growing animosity towards Western culture that emerged in Iran was a pivotal phenomenon in history that drastically altered the way the 2 countries interacted and viewed one another. As broadcast media grew more popular, every day Americans were exposed to and became horrified by the images of Iranian revolutionaries burning American flags, binding US citizens, and wishing harm to the American nation. This image, in many ways, still plagues the way in which Americans perceive Iran. The embargoes themselves also served as a force that split the countries apart. Though a compromise was eventually reached, the relationship between America and Iran was by no means fully restored. The hostage crisis to this day remains a major symbol of Iran and America's tumultuous past. The hostility it bred and the anger it encouraged still hinders efforts of American leaders to communicate with Iran. However, landmark agreements such as the nuclear deal or growing discontent from the remaining Islamist regime among Iranian citizens may be paving a new, unforeseeable future for the United States and Iran.